Hello and welcome to our latest YouTube conversation, and we're delighted to welcome somebody from one of the organisations in which we remember, Eurogroup for Animals, Camilla Bjorkbum, who is the political advisor on food policy for Eurogroup for Animals. And we'll be talking about Eurogroup and the work that Camilla does. So let me start with that, Camilla, because you're the political advisor for food policy. So what does that role encompass? What do you do for Eurogroup?
It's a very exciting role because it's quite new for Eurogroup to work on this in this way that we're doing now. And it's actually, the background is actually when the European Commission launched the Green Deal, and under the European Green Deal, there is a specific strategy which is called the Farm to Fork strategy, and that strategy aims to create healthy, sustainable food systems. And it also mentions improved animal welfare, and it goes into many of the aspects that we are working on. So my role at Eurogroup is to work on the Farm to Fork strategy and on all the initiatives that are under the Farm to Fork strategy. And there are many things happening. So at Eurogroup for Animals, previously, under previous commissions, we've had a bit of, there's been a bit of a standstill. So not much has happened. And all of a sudden, there are many avenues that are opening up to both improve the lives of animals, but also the actual food system, so how food is produced, and to work for more plant-based food also.
That seems to me to cover an enormous amount. I mean, you know, from farm to fork, there is a lot of different aspects to that journey. I mean, that must cover an enormous range of different types of issues.
Yes, you are very right. So one of the first deliverables that the Commission had under the Farm to Fork strategy was, for example, to develop a code of conduct for responsible businesses and marketing practices. So we were involved in that work. So that is really the working with the retailers to make voluntary commitments, what they are willing to commit. And we managed to have commitments to improve animal welfare in there. So that was good. Then it also goes into subsidies that are paid. For example, there is a subsidy program for marketing. So business associations can apply for marketing pig meat, for example, to young consumers. There has been such campaigns previously where they've seen that young people tend to avoid pork. So then there was a targeted money and campaign to incentivize that consumption among young people. So that is another one of the areas which is now being reviewed. So that's quite exciting. We will see what happens. We think that no public money should be spent on promotion of animal products.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, it just strikes me that's an incredibly political thing, because one of the discussions which goes on in this country, and I presume goes on across Europe as well, is the fact that younger people are more likely to be vegan, and that is generally seen in this country, apart from amongst meat farmers, obviously, as being a positive thing with respect to sustainability, with respect to the future of things like climate change and so on. So, I mean, is one of the problems that you face the fact, or is it the fact, that the European Union is more heavily influenced by producer groups in this, by the farmers, than they are by the consumers who are seeking change?
Yes, I think that has been, that has also been one of the big obstacles, because indeed there is a heavy and well-financed lobby machine that tries to prevent these changes. But on the other hand, you know, we have young people, and I think especially now with the movement that has been led by Greta Thunberg, there is, you know, more civil society voices and young people that are making their voices heard now. They are maybe not explicitly campaigning on food, but they are campaigning on the environment. And we know what science says. We really need to cut down on both animal production and animal consumption. There is also one quite interesting legislative initiative that is coming out of the Farm to Fork strategy. It's called Sustainable Food Systems Framework Law. So that is a completely new law that hasn't, it's just in the very, very initial stage. So there will be a public consultation on it next year. But that is a very interesting initiative, and to follow that and to influence that in order to really try to make that law into something that can transform, you know, not just inform consumers through labeling, but actually transform the system in a more substantial way.
Absolutely. Interestingly, I noticed on the Eurogroup website that you're not actually entirely alone, because you now have a political advisor for insect farming.
Yes, that's true. And that is also one of the things that, I mean, we've known for some time that insects are increasingly being reared for both for food, for people, where there has been maybe more resistance because people are not really convinced by eating insects, I don't think. But maybe more worrying is that insects are now also reared for animal feed. So rearing insects in these massive industrial facilities to produce feed for pigs and poultry and fish that are also reared in massive industrial facilities. So I think that is very worrying. And unfortunately, the Farm to Fork strategy does promote insects as an alternative protein. And it has very much been a quite uncritical discussion on insect farming. Also, many environmental groups see that if we can produce insect protein for animal feed in Europe, then we can reduce deforestation in Latin America, for example. So we have really tried to think, you know, about how can we approach this from a more critical view. So we did receive a funding grant from let me now think. It's a fund that works on effective altruism. So it's called the Effective Altruism Fund. Mm-hmm. So they specifically wanted to fund this project. So we have now employed a colleague of mine who is looking into how can we shape this debate? What can we do in Europe to curb this growth? We might not be able to stop it completely, but at least we should be able to diminish it, because it can be really bad if it's expanding and it just facilitates pig and poultry production.
Well, I think it's certainly important to have a critical voice in there, to have some debate. And I mean, the future of protein production is clearly a big issue. Philip Nimbury referred to it in his conversation with us a few months ago. And it seems to me that one of the things that is the case is that financed producer lobby that you talked about, the farmers, the retailers, are getting behind things like insect production, are getting behind things like production of protein from cells and things of that nature. And the animal advocacy lobby seems to be a bit one step behind the arguments, playing catch up on this. And do you think that's a fair comment?
I think we were a little bit behind, before, because we didn't really see it taking off. And then all of a sudden there were these authorizations by the Commission of species that are authorized for food, but also the authorization, because previously it wasn't allowed to feed insects to farmed animals, and that was actually because of the BSE scandals and all the health and the safety reasons with feeding animals to other animals. But then there was the recently this year that it became allowed to feed insects to pigs and poultry. So I think that was really also a wake-up call that this is happening and this is advancing and it's going quite quickly. And I think also another aspect is there's so little that we know about we don't know so much about the insects themselves, and also about what ecological consequences can there be if you have so large numbers, of insects.
Yeah. Well, I remember when I was at university, which is a while ago now, you had these, it was a time when these sociologists who were talking about risk theory and risk were in prominence. And it stuck with me, the idea that one of the problems with environmental issues, with ecological issues, is that they are so complex that not only do we not understand the implications, but we cannot understand the implications. Like, for example, genetic manipulation of plants. Now that has become something which has been landed on us, and we have it now. It's there, and it strikes me though we still do not know the implications of that. We still do not know how that's going to pan out. And with things like insect production, with things like the changes that have been talked about with protein production, these things are also true. We don't know how these things are going to pan out.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right in that. And with the insects, we also have the issue. We know that climate change is already happening. So we see we already see the consequences of extreme weather, the floodings and heavy rainfall, etc. And then, one of the concerns, apart from the welfare of the actual insects and what they need, because we don't know so much about the species, should also be if you have these extreme weather events and if you have millions and millions of insects and that facility is damaged and you have a mass release of the same species of insects, what are the consequences then on local agriculture, on local wildlife, on pollinators, for example, that are they are already struggling. So I think there are many things that is really lacking from the conversation on this. Yeah.
Maybe you should have a look at those kind of like mice infestations in Australia now and again to see some of the consequences of this kind of thing. However, one of the things which I want to talk about is that we do tend in animal advocacy to talk about the producers as being the villains. It's all them who are doing nasty things, the farmers, all this kind of stuff. And that seems to me to be somewhat unfair, because there are certainly an increasing body of farmers who actually support change, who are seeing, for example, the damage climate change is doing to their soil systems and is doing to their crops, but who find it difficult to change because of the pressures on them from the economic system. Is Eurogroup, concerned about supporting those kind of producers and supporting change in farming away from, say, meat production towards other forms of agricultural production?
Yes, and I think that yes. So there's a lot of sort of responsibility put on the producer side. I think also on the consumers there are a lot of sort of responsibility place that they should choose the right food. But I think, you know, when you go to the fundamental level, it's really a question about politics and about political responsibility. So for farmers, for example, you know, it should be a political responsibility to direct subsidies to, for example, high state-of-the-art animal welfare facilities where you have more space, the animals can behave in ways that are according to their needs.
Yeah.
But as you know, the subsidy system of the EU doesn't look like that yet. It's quite far away from it. So I think that's one thing where politics is very important. And I think the other one is public procurement, which is also very important in order to, you know, there you can really also, you could support the better system, and you could, when you do public procurement, serve more plant-based food, and then the meat that is served, that is less, but that you spend more money on it, so that it comes from the best systems that we have today.
One of the things that which again stuck me from university life was somebody once said to me that if you want to see where power is in the system, have a look at who's making the money. And if you look at that in the food system, there are certainly some farming organisations, large concerns mainly, who are making quite a bit of money. But the people who are really making a lot of money out of food, it seems to me, are the big retail giants, the big supermarket chains, and you know, increasingly nowadays, online deliveries. I mean, you've seen it with various companies getting in, initially, ironically, with plant-based online deliveries, but increasingly with a wider range, and companies like Amazon coming on board. Are we really capable of standing up to the financial clout and the political power of these kind of economic giants?
I think that is a very, very good question. And when you mentioned online, the online shopping, for example, I think, I mean, that is something that has gone sort of beyond or under the radar also. Also because in many ways we are relying very much on the consumer to navigate. As I said earlier, that we put a lot of responsibility on the consumer to make the choice that is the good choice for the animals, but not only for the animals, but also for workers, for the environment. And in the end, you know, the consumer only has so much money to spend. So I think with online marketing and those sort of new businesses, this can be a difficulty. For example, if you rely a lot on the consumer and on labeling, because then you really have to make sure that the label is well displayed, and because you look at the packages in a very different way when you see them in the store and online. On the other side, it might be easier. I mean, an online retailer could maybe make it easier for the consumer to make the right choices by displaying the products. So I think that what we should do with big companies, now I'm not really answering your question whether we have power, but what is important is that these companies, they have a lot of power, and they actually shape, we call it the food environment that the consumers act in. So by their, you know, their marketing, the way they display products, their prices, they sort of direct the consumer in a certain way. And of course, they have a lot of power to also direct consumers to make choices for more plant-based and to direct them to the highest products with regard to animal welfare.
Well, absolutely. Over many years, these people have poured millions and millions into psychological profiling, for example. And it's actually frightening how they can profile us from just our cash receipts at the supermarket, which is really is amazing if you've ever seen it done. And they also have a considerable amount of power as well over the economic environment which farming operates, in which farms do their business too, which I think is we need to also bring into the equation. In addition, of course, many of them now are international organizations, transnational organizations, operate across national borders. Is that something which actually the European Union helps with in terms of having a single body which covers most of the continent?
I think that's I think that's I think the thing with the European Union is that, yes, there is a lot of advantage, but it's also, always the problem with the European Union is also that it's only as strong in a way that its member states are.
Yes.
So I think a lot can be done, and luckily today we have a European Commission that is at least wanting to do something on sustainability, and is also committed to animal welfare. But then there is also resistance in some member states on this whole food system transformation that is needed. But nevertheless, I think that, the strategies like Farm to Fork strategy, the European Green Deal, and all these strategies, although they are not legally binding, they have an agenda setting function. So it's really a matter of, what's happening in the heads of people. But I think that the problem here is that I think it's a matter of time, because we really need to, change the system quite quickly. We don't have a lot of time. And for the animals, it always hurts me that, every year that things are delayed, or every year that decade even, that things are delayed, then there are so many animals that are suffering. But also now we have the climate crisis. So we know that there is really a time limit. We have like a window where we can take action.
I must admit, Camilla, I kind of wish that I was able to done this kind of conversation with someone like you 10, 15 years ago when I was teaching at university, because when I was teaching European politics, all of my students should come in with this kind of like very British idea about how the European Union was dominating our politics and taking away our sovereignty and all this kind of stuff. And it was tremendously difficult to persuade them, actually, that the individual member states were really the powers in the European Union, and that Britain actually was a very powerful member state when we were in the European Union. But anyway, that's by the by. One thing which I do want to pick up on is one we've only talked about in passing is fish. And recently, our first conversation on the YouTube channel a year ago now was with a group in the Czech Republic, Open Your Eyes, who were doing some stuff on carp fishing during the Advent season. And they've got another video up on their website now, a new one. And there are certainly kind of like cultural pockets in the European Union where fish, consumption of fish is linked to religion, to cultural values, but there's also a rise in the European Union in industrial fish farming as well. How significant is that? Well, I mean, in addition as well, I mean, the other thing I should also throw in is that the European Union has been heavily criticised in the past for the way it subsidised industrial trawling and industrial catching of fish. How does that kind of like fit in with your role and the kind of things that you're up to?
Quite a lot, actually, because as we talked about previously about the insect farming, so insects is since 2017 one of the feeds that can be given to fish in aquaculture. So that is one of the links, but also because there are very interesting developments now, in terms of fish welfare, which has really coming up on the agenda. So that is also something, and I can see from, for example, food businesses and companies that they are interested also in fish welfare in a new way that they were not previously. Then I'm personally not working on the fisheries policies. I have another colleague who is really the expert on fish, but yes, it does tie in a lot. And also, we talk for land animals, we often talk about the problem of the feed, and you have this, it's called food feed competition, where we're growing crops on big areas of land, and these crops are then fed to factory farmed animals, whereas this land could instead be used more efficiently to produce food for people. And in fish farming, there is something similar, because you use fish to feed carnivorous fish, and that is just that is sort of a parallel problem. So what we do say is that when there is aquaculture, there should only be low-trophic fish species, so only the ones that are can be fed on sort of plant feed, instead of being fed on other fish. So I think that is also something that is important. What is worrying when it comes to fish is that it is often seen as a more sustainable alternative. And I think that is, and that you even have in the sort of official discourse. I think that is also something that is problematic. And we should always, whenever we compare animal protein, we should always compare that, I think, to the most sustainable protein, which is plant-based. So we can eat much more plant-based, and then this small amount of animal products can then come from really high welfare systems.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember the way in which we produce our food, particularly if we're going to produce it from, as you say, animal sources, then that distorts not the whole agricultural system, the whole way in which, because we're having to produce food for the animals to produce food for us, and that's something which frequently gets lost in the discussion, I think. So it's important to do that. Chris, what do you think about the conversation so far? Is there anything that you want to contribute or talk about?
Yeah, I do. It's already covered quite a lot of ground.
Yeah.
The one word that jumps out at me, which you haven't actually used, but you've alluded to it a lot, is the word death. So many deaths of animals to feed other animals to feed us. I mean, let's think about that in using that word. We're killing some animals to feed other animals. Then we're killing those animals to feed us. That's bonkers. I mean, it really, and if you look upon it in that analysis of what the system does, you think, who created a system like this? And if you put it in that context, and of course, most people won't think about it in that context. But it is, and here we're talking about the now huge growth in insect farming to feed other animals to feed us, along with already mentioned the use of feeder fish as well. It is, if you think about it just in those terms alone, it is a bonkers system that, and how have we got to a position like this? Now, from a CCA perspective, of course, one of the things, another word that we've not used yet, and I'll throw it into the debate now, is hierarchy. The hierarchy of animals, and I talk about this a lot, and I'm often asked, oh, are we defending that animal because it's sentient? And I say, no, And this quite shocked us. And I don't really care that much about the sentience of animals. That quite shocks people, as I care about animals, whether they're sentient or otherwise, from our perspective, because they're God's creatures and belong to God. And we've got all this hierarchy of animals, and again, without being critical of colleagues over the decades in the animal advocacy, animal welfare movement, we've always concentrated, at least in my impression, on big totemic species. The blue whale, the panda in China, the tiger in India, the polar bear sat on the ice floe. And now we're looking at the destruction of all these insects to feed other animals, to feed us. It is a bonkers world. And so that's just an immediate reaction from me about what's been said so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, you know, I mean, you're quite right. You know, we talk about these big, nobody ever mentions the passenger pigeon. You know, that went. No one seems to be bothered very much. And I think it is important. I mean, you know, we've talked before in other forums about the way in which agricultural producers use words which move away from the actual lives of these animals. I mean, fishing is most obvious, where they talk about stock and they talk about tonnage instead of the number of fish caught, the individual fish that are caught and processed. And
the number of individual insects.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, yeah.
Aggravating now. I mean, we talk. I don't interrupt, but you and I have been doing quite a bit of work on this, comparing the billions of land animals to the trillions of fish. I dread to think if the number's been invented for the amount of insects which could be sold out here. You know. Yeah.
I quite agree. And
they're individuals. That's a new slogan for 2022. Insects are individuals.
Yeah. And I think that's something which actually, you know, religion in general, and I mean specifically Laudato Si, introduces into the debate in a different sort of way, which is important. Mind you, that isn't immediately addressed to you, Camilla, because you know, that's something we believe and we think and we hold strongly, because you know, for us, religion is one of the ways in which we're improving the way in which we look at these things. But with respect to Eurogroup, you know, we're a member organisation of Eurogroup. How important to somebody like you who works in Eurogroup are the member organisations and the kind of influence we bring to the table?
Oh, the member organizations are Eurogroup for Animals, so it's really the tool or the vehicle for the member organizations to, I think it serves several purposes. The most obvious is maybe, you know, to be able to come together to influence European politics. But then, you know, exchange between members is also something, and that Eurogroup is really, you know, something that the members can use. And for Eurogroup to drive change in the European institutions, so the Commission, the Parliament, the Council, it's really important to have a broad basis of member organizations coming from all different, because it's also, I think, what is fantastic with Eurogroup for Animals is that we are gathering members from quite different organizations across the Europe, and actually a little bit beyond also. So, but it's really, I think the importance of the members cannot be overstated, because without the members, it just wouldn't have the power. And I think also what is important is that, you know, even though you may think, you know, about Eurogroup for Animals as working at the EU level, which it does, but in order to do that successfully, you need to have representation in the member states. So members that can carry out campaign, that can call their MPs, that can pressure their government, or that can just, you know, raise awareness among the citizens. Yeah,
and you have had some great success campaigning. I recall at the AGM the announcement of the legislation which came out of the end of the cage age campaign, which was a tremendous success for Eurogroup.
Yeah, that's a very good example as a success of member organizations coming together. So that campaign was actually initiated by one of the members, Compassionate World Farming, and Eurogroup for Animals also endorsed the campaign, and there were so many organizations across Europe that came together. And it's quite fantastic because there has been many initiatives, it's called ECI, European Citizen Initiative. So if you start an ECI, then you gather at least 1 million signatures from a certain, to have a certain percentage in a certain number of member states. There has been many initiatives, I think around 80, but not so many have been successful. And even fewer, there's less than a handful that have actually, been successful and that will have the power to transform or change anything that will actually, transform into legislation. And this initiative, End the Cage Age, is one of those successful initiatives. So I think that really also, it just shows the power of the movement.
If I could come in there quickly,
yeah.
Sorry. The End the Cage Age campaign was very, very interesting for me, not only in obviously the policy of the campaign and the way members of Eurogroup and others came together to work together to get those names, but it brought home to me that the power of the modern petition, because I think I've said this elsewhere previously. I was relatively cynical about petitions for a long time because I thought that people signed them and they didn't really go very far, and they what happened to them when they were handed into wherever they went, they just often ended up in a black hole or in a cupboard, or in the worst case scenario, some I've seen they ended up in the bin. But here we see the power of the modern petition at the European level, and it also happening in member states or ex-member states like the UK, where the petition is now can get debates at Westminster, for example, if you get the correct number. So that enhances the power of the individual across Europe to say, well, actually, if I do sign this, it may have an outcome. Whereas in the past, if you were cynical like me, think if I do sign this, it may just end up in a waste paper bin somewhere. Now, so it's very, I found that very interesting, a demonstration of the power of the modern petition. Organizations, governments, European commissions, whoever have always said, we'll take notice of a big petition, but often didn't. But now, because of the modern petition and the rules and legislations of the governing bodies that control our lives, we've seen a direct consequence of that petition, and that has been quite interesting for me to notice over the last year or two.
I agree. It's nice to see political organisations actually paying attention to the people they're supposed to represent. I mean, it's perhaps debatable whether debates in Westminster actually achieve much in the end, but maybe that's my cynicism about Trump.
Oh no, I wasn't equating the outcome of a debate at Westminster Hall.
No, but
at least they have to have that debate.
Yeah, they're formally part of the structure now, which is useful in this country. Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that's true about climate change, Camilla, is that it's putting a lot of pressure now on agricultural production in terms of the distance that things move around the globe in order to be consumed. And it strikes me that pressure is only going to grow, because certainly with respect to air travel, and given that most of these things are perishable, air travel simply at the moment has no real claim for sustainability, and it's difficult to see how it could ever achieve any claim for sustainability. So how does that affect the kind of things that you are involved in as a policy advocate? Are we seeing a move in the corridors of power towards emphasising more local production?
Yeah, I think so, in both good and bad ways, because I think that, the insect farming that we talked about previously is partly a consequence also of, Europe wanting to have a locally produced protein feed for pigs and poultry and fish. So that's the negative side. But on the positive side, I think that, for example, the Sustainable Food Systems Framework Law that I mentioned in the beginning, it's an initiative under the Farm to Fork strategy, which is going to be, well, the process has just started, so it still has a long road ahead of it. But within that, for example, I think these are issues that can be addressed and discussed. How do we use, because I mean, basically it's a question also, how do we use the land that we have available in Europe? Currently, the major part of the arable land is used to produce animal feed. And that is not, it's not sustainable from an environmental point of view. And Chris also pointed out the death that are involved for the animals and the suffering that is involved for all these animals. So I think the land and the feed discussions can be helpful in this sense, because it really pins down what's wrong with this system that really relies on soy that is produced in Brazil and that has caused deforestation, for example.
One of the things which has been a feature of subsidy to farming for some time now has been a kind of encouragement of an element to use the currently fashionable rewilding, of turning things back to nature. I don't want to make a big deal of this, because a lot of it is actually kind of they're different grades of this, really. I mean, there's some serious rewilding projects out there, and then they're kind of just leaving a bit of ground to have some wild flowers in it, and there are massive differences to this, but there are also kind of problems with that. We've seen them in Wales, for example, where I mean, on one hand, we had a farmer a few miles away from here who took government subsidy to plant trees on his property, brought in a government regulated company to plant those trees, and then was sued by the government for planting them in the wrong place. So we've had those kind of experiences on the one hand. On the other hand, there are areas in Wales where large carbon producers, again, particularly airline companies, have bought up big areas of land, bought big stocks of one type of tree, and planted this monoculture in these places, which of course helps nothing. I mean, is that something which you would get involved in terms of your role, or would other people in your group get involved in that? Because it strikes me that is something that needs addressing as well.
Yes, no, not so much into rewilding, but I think it makes me think of this development where we're looking for quick fixes, and we're looking to fix things in ways that may not be good long-term solutions. And one example in factory farming or intensive in these intensive systems is where you try to, instead of thinking, okay, we need to reduce the number of animals, how do we produce food for people without animal protein? Then instead you have this development where you try to see how you can do like technological fixes on reducing emissions from the animals, manure management, or different additions to like feed additives that you add certain products to the feed. And that is, of course, I mean, that is really not tackling the root problem that we have. And I think this was something that was also seen at the COP26, where there were discussions on agriculture, And there was also a methane pledge signed by over 100 countries in the end. And it was really good to see how methane and the emissions from animal agriculture were on the agenda. They were addressed, but then it seems that in the actual agreement there were more mentionings of these manure management systems and novel feed and new feed additives, but not really any recognition or anything that would decrease the number of animals. So maybe that will be the next step. Maybe we're on a path now to at least recognize the emissions, but we also need to reduce the number of animals.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, when COP26 was on, the BBC News has this program called Click, which it examines technology, and it was almost entirely devoted to agriculture. These devices that measure the breath of cows and all that kind of stuff, and these areas where you can have methane rooms on farms where you capture all the methane. That is not an answer. That is not a solution. Methane's still there. It's it's got to go somewhere sometime. And
sorry, if I could come quickly, because I'm glad we've got, just briefly discussed COP26 and methane, because we've been, as again I've said before, CCA have been arguing for years about methane in climate change scenarios, not just carbon dioxide. And although it is good news that over 100 countries have signed this pledge to reduce methane, some of the big players have not. And then we now are hearing about, oh, well, actually we can do this, and this to reduce methane emission from agriculture, which isn't going to increase animal welfare one iota, actually, from what I'm starting to hear. Oh, we can reduce the methane from animal agriculture by capturing, not doing it, but it actually is going to improve the lives of the animals, which is what we're talking about regarding methane reduction. So it's already the good news is getting a little bit glossed over, and starting when we see the detail that what appears to be a great headline for the European Union and the United States, frankly, who brought this to the table at Glasgow. The actual, when you, like the old saying, when you look at the detail, the small print, not quite so good.
Absolutely. I think one of the things which is true about this is that the way in which these various technological fixes are sold as if they are an improvement to the animal's life. And I mean, in essence, the life of the animal hasn't changed. It's just some elements of its relationship to us which have changed. So I mean, technological fixes are just, things we need to be suspicious of, I think.
I think that's very well put, and we are suspicious. And we will continue to monitor in great detail the detail of this wonderful announcement. So it is a good announcement. I don't want to be too cynical. It is a good announcement, and we welcome it. We welcome the commitment of the countries. But let's, as they say, as you told when you're young, look at the small print. We need to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, and I think this is also a good, an example, not necessarily a good example, but it's an example of what happens when animal welfare isn't seen as part of sustainability. Because if you have a concept of sustainability that is only about emissions, then that might not be good for animal welfare. And I think this is an example, whereas if we have a definition of sustainability that really includes the animals' lives and their welfare, then we will also come to different solutions. As you said, these quick fixes, they are not about improving animal welfare.
One of the things which I also wanted to ask about, Camilla, is us Brits are a rather insular lot, as you'll probably be aware. And of course, one of the things which has exercised us recently has been this thing called Brexit, and the fact that we have withdrawn ourselves, so heroically from the European Union. How does that affect someone like you in terms, I mean, is that a complicating factor of the work that you have to do? Or is that something where actually now it's a bit clearer where Britain is and the kind of problems that we have?
I think it's a shame because I think the UK was a great ally in many of these issues. And I know that, for example, on animal welfare, I mean, the UK has played an important role. So for advancing animal welfare in the EU, that is it's really a loss in that sense. But then we've said that, you know, we are not only talking about the EU, we are talking about Europe. So we are very keen on maintaining strong bonds with all the UK members, because it's still, I mean, we can still work across the borders, and perhaps developments in the UK can, or in the UK can lead to development in the EU, and developments in the EU can also maybe lead to or be used to improve things for animals in the UK. So we are very committed to continue to working together.
One of the things which has been part of the debate in the UK has been the way in which animal welfare is likely to go now. I mean, we have a government who is saying that we will have better animal welfare standards than, well, world leading, because we're such a world leading country in so many ways. And one of the things that has been a matter of concern is the way in which trade agreements may impinge upon that, particularly trade agreements with countries which don't have the same kind of standards which exist in this country or which exist in the European Union. Do you worry that that may be a kind of like backdoor way of eroding animal welfare standards more widely across Europe?
I think, yeah, I mean, trade is very, very important. So I think that what is needed is really to have in trade agreements that you have conditionality requirements, so that the products that are important should meet equivalent standards, and that you strive to have stronger standards, because we don't want to see any kind of slippery slope where instead of, you know, striving towards stricter standards, we instead go in the other direction. So yes, that is definitely something that is very important that we get that right.
Once again, Camilla, I mean, this conversation has really covered an enormous amount of ground, and I'm very impressed at your ability to deal with all the things that we've thrown at you in terms of the kind of being able to provide good answers to these kind of questions. Before we go, Chris, is there anything you want to add to this, which you haven't interrupted on already?
Not only to say thank you to Camilla for a wonderful conversation,
yeah,
and just to, I think I'll just end by saying, obviously, you know, when we talk about, when CCA, that is, talks about animal advocacy and animal issues, we covered a whole gamut of animal advocacy matters, as the Eurogroup, but, you know, it's not only food is companions and wild animals, etc., etc. But food, of course, remains, and diet remains the area where most animals are affected, the huge numbers that we talk about.
Yeah.
And just to, I think the final point I would like to make is this, in some ways, very, very depressing part of our conversation, in that while we've been fighting for a reduction in the number of animals that are affected by human desire to eat them, we've now got these, God knows how many insects being brought into play, which is, rather than going in the right direction, we've got a whole new gamut of creatures being brought into play for human food consumption. And that's actually pretty depressing, frankly. I don't want to end on a depressing note, but you know, as I said, we talk a lot about the billions of land animals trillions of fish, and now we got the poor old insect population being brought into play just to feed one lot of animals, again, to feed another lot, to feed us. I mean, it is bonkers, and I'll just leave it there on that one.
I think it's certainly worth bearing in mind what a dynamic area this is. There's an enormous amount of change going on in food production in agriculture at the moment, and yeah, some of it is not necessarily good, and we need to bear that in mind. Camilla, is there anything that you would like to say or to add before we depart?
Oh, I think we've covered quite a lot.
I think you're right.
There's nothing. We've covered the COP26, we covered EU, we covered UK, we've covered animal welfare, we've covered sustainability. I'm just looking a little bit. I was taking some notes of all the areas that we've covered. So yes, I think fish we have discussed that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me. It's been a really nice conversation. It's very, very good to be part of this and to talk about these areas.
Well, I'm glad you've enjoyed it. I mean, part of the reason for this is to give people like you a chance to actually say what you want to say, rather than, you know, being forced to answer a series of questions which, you know, may have nothing to do with anything in many journalistic ways. But very pleased that you've enjoyed it. We certainly have enjoyed it. And I think I'm talking for Chris as well as myself here. And again, tremendously impressed at the range of things that we've thrown at you, and you've batted back very ably. So thank you very much for that. And, you know, I mean, we may be in contact again in the not too distant future to have another crack at a few more different areas. But in the meantime, thank you for that, Camilla. And thank you for watching this conversation on YouTube from Catholic Concern for Animals. We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we've enjoyed it, and we hope that it's helped to inform and expand your views on these areas. Thank you.